My fellows, let me just double check on this thing real quick. Alright, so we haven't been able to get on for a few days, pretty much anywhere. The tornadoes that hit last week messed up quite a lot of the local towns, so my internet access and stuff at my house is shut down, and they sent out a thing basically showing that there isn't really a timeline of when it's going to be back operational or not, so I don't know if I need to swap internet providers or anything like that. But for right now, I want to get into some of this because I've been researching some stuff on my phone. And essentially, I started thinking about Star Citizen again. I'm getting back into it again. The Helldivers thing is kind of burning out a little bit, like I thought it might, but I'll probably go back and play it a little bit. But this came down with battleships. So essentially, I was thinking about the Perseus quite a lot. And then in my mind, for a while, I was thinking the Perseus is kind of like a battleship, and it sort of is. But it got me going down this rabbit hole of military ship like namings and timelines and everything else. And if they're going to do like ranking systems and stuff. But essentially, I found a list of old like capital ships that like all the capital ships that are supposed to be in Star Citizen. And there was a video that I watched where people were talking about carriers, and they were saying the Beagle carrier is like the main fleet carrier, and the if you look at like carrier fleets and stuff like that for the militaries, they have escort carriers, right? So there's a ship labeled as an escort carrier that's also a capital ship that isn't purchasable. And this got me going down a road where I was thinking, these $700 ships or whatever that we can buy in the game, they're not that big. If you really think about it, like the Perseus and the Carrack and stuff, they're decently sized ships, but in the grand scheme of thing, for like $700, they're not massive ships. The Kraken and stuff is a pretty big ship, okay? But you're looking at $3,000 for it and having to fight a million other people trying to buy it, okay? And then when you look at that, the video I watched, they were talking about the Kraken being a light or a medium carrier, and they were saying that there still needs to be a light carrier somewhere. But if you look up the Kraken, it says it's a light carrier, and that's because there's basically already every carrier in the game listed. So you have the Liberator isn't technically a carrier, but essentially I'm putting that as like an amphibious assault ship kind of thing, and also a cheap man's escort carrier. All right. And then you have the Kraken, which is the light carrier. Then there's a capital ship that's an escort carrier, and then there's a capital ship that's the Beagle carrier. All right. But what got me thinking about this is that I'm a big fan of battleships. I just like battleships, even though they always kind of, get destroyed by some stuff. And the Perseus was the closest thing, and I've been hyped about the Perseus quite a bit. But then I realized that there's an actual destroyer in the game, or not a destroyer, a battleship in the game, and it's supposed to be a capital class battleship, but there's only one of them in the verse, and I don't even remember what it's called, and it doesn't really have a bunch of pictures or anything of it. I'd have to go in here and look it up real quick. I'm gonna move my paperwork. So we got capital ships. I know there's a list. The Retribution. So the fleet carrier is a Beagle, escort carrier is a Pegasus, a battleship is the Retribution, which is apparently massive. It's a super dreadnought. And they have a battle cruiser. Flyable battle cruiser was part of the 17 million stretch goal. No concept art has ever been announced so far. So like we're missing a battle cruiser, we're missing a cruiser. You know, and then the Polaris is a Corvette. It says we're missing the light frigate, and then the Idris is a frigate. And this is where I'm kind of getting into things. Those ships are $3,000 plus ships, which means if you want to build an actual military fleet, it's going to be thousands and thousands of dollars or a lot of in-game time to build, which is why people are buying these bigger ships. I don't think there's much for the information. Yeah, see, like the Retribution has a vague picture of one that looks to have a massive cannon on top, but not like a ton of guns. And it says Shipbuster Railgun. Not really a whole lot of other information about it. But this got me going down a whole pipeline for like military ships and stuff because I basically was thinking, if you're gonna make an actual carrier group or whatever, like a real life military, the Beagle would be the main carrier. So only a few of those are going to be in the verse. Not everyone's going to have it, which means that you have to go a step down. So then the escort carrier that's under the Beagle, also, we don't know if it's purchasable, but if it's bigger than a Javelin, which I'd assume it is, it's probably not. So you're probably going to have to find those in verse 2. So then the smallest carrier you have is the light carrier for the Kraken, and then it's not really a carrier because it's not capable of carrying as much firepower as the other carriers, but it's going to be the best thing that you have. If they do like an in-between carrier, like a medium carrier or something, I would hopefully I would want it to be like an anvil design maybe, but it looks like the anvil designs might be like they could make the battleships and stuff anvil, or they could do a modern military anvil design for each of the different warships going up, like battleships and cruisers and stuff could be anvil because they're heavier armored or something along those lines. So there's still a possibility for anvil capital ships, which I'm kind of looking forward to. If they have like a cruiser or anything. But then when you go to Star Citizen and you kind of look at the ships, it's hard to tell what the ship differences are because you're not in water. So like submarines, for instance, you don't have underwater and above water like a naval game. They're not like submersibles. And then you don't really have like shallow water and stuff, but planet surfaces are about the closest thing you're going to get to shallow water. So, like the gunboats and the shallow water type fighting crafts are more going to be planetary surface crafts, as far as I can tell. And then everything is kind of mishmashed together because you have like torpedo boats, which are like fast boats that shoot torpedoes and destroy stuff. Then you have like submarines, which are, you know, stealthy, going underwater, shooting torpedoes, blowing up ships. So a torpedo boat and a submarine are kind of the same thing in space, but then you have bombers, which have torpedoes, which is basically the same thing in space. And then you have destroyers, which later on would be, torpedo shooting destroyers. So everything kind of mismatches together. So for instance, if you take the Retaliator, the Perseus, and the Nautilus, those are like the three like large ships that you can get early game that like probably aren't going to be too hard to find and get a hold of. Okay? Now, trying to figure out what like first off, I thought the Perseus might be a battleship, but then it's not. And then I thought it was might be like, you know, a patrol boat that kind of goes around planet surfaces, and I think that's partially it. But then you have what, frigates or cruisers. So apparently cruisers are like faster battleships, and then frigates can be either bigger or smaller than a destroyer, but they kind of do the same thing. And cruisers are capable solo ships. Frigates are also, and frigates and destroyers are all kind of like capable solo ships. But then when you compare these, they're kind of the same in a weird way because the Retaliator is kind of like a submarine, but it's classified as a bomber. But it has size 9 torpedoes, which can blow up big ships. And then it has a bunch of machine guns, which can be used as anti-air, which makes you think, you could potentially slot that in as like a destroyer platform. But it can also be a torpedo boat. And then if you have a destroyer that's going to hunt a torpedo boat, you could also use the Retaliator to hunt the Retaliator. But a Perseus could also hunt a Retaliator, except for a Perseus is said to be heavily armored and probably isn't as fast as a Retaliator. So then, what else do you got? And that's the Nautilus. And the Nautilus is probably more like a destroyer. I wrote it down as a frigate, but it's probably more like a destroyer, like an old school one, except for it has those big guns on it. So when you get a Nautilus, you're getting 24 landmines that get attracted to targets and blow up that do the same damage as like a size 7 torpedo or something along those lines. And then you get size 7 cannon guns on it, and then you get size 3 uh, turrets. And all like the 7 guns and the size 3 turrets are basically the same thing you're going to get for the Perseus. And then the torpedoes, you get 24 mines, which basically do the same sort of damage as the size 5 torpedoes that are on the Perseus. So if you go for the Nautilus, it's probably less armored, probably moves faster, might be fast enough to catch a Retaliator, I don't know. But the mines are kind of like depth charges where they get attracted to a target. So if you're trying to defend against a torpedo boat or a submarine, you could actually use the mines to lay out a defensive wall against those ships, and then the size 7s might do enough damage to cripple them. But the Nautilus also has missile launchers, which can shoot, decently sized missiles. I have to look at it. 1 second here. I mean, it's subject to change, however they want to change it. But when you look at a destroyer, if they're sent out to find and destroy torpedo boats or submarines, then they're probably going to need good sensors and things. And then also they're supposed to find and clear out mines. The Nautilus is the only thing that's really made to clear out mines so far. And then apparently frigates and destroyers both kind of do a similar role, except for a destroyer's a destroyer, and a frigate is kind of like a cruiser, but less armored and faster. Basically, what I'm figuring out is that a battleship is a very armored, slow artillery-like shooting ship. Then a cruiser is a ship that has the guns of a battleship, but more or less varying armor to be faster so that it can hit a battleship but also run away. Or it can destroy everything a battleship can, but it can run away from the battleship. And then the cruiser is basically, or the frigate is basically the cruiser, but it doesn't have as big of guns and it has more utility. But then the frigate and the destroyer kind of flip flop back and forth. So it's like, any case, when you're looking at the Nautilus, it's saying that you have one sized 7 turret, so you're going to get two size 7 guns. You get 4x size 3 guns on 2 size 3 turrets. Then you get 1x size 3 belly turret missile rack. And then you get the 24 mines that can also be turned into projectile shooting things. So like anti-fighter stuff. So the Nautilus, in my mind, is probably the closest thing to a destroyer that you can have for a small fleet, because you're going to have mines that act as torpedoes, and you're going to be able to pick up the minefields, and you're going to have missiles for anti-air defense, and you're going to have the size 3 turrets for anti-air and anti-torpedo stuff, I guess, and then you're going to have the size 7 guns to deal with subcapital class threats, but you're not going to have as good of a look as the Perseus, and you're not going to have as thick of armor as the Perseus, but you'll most likely be faster. And then the Perseus could also be kind of in the same situation, but it's heavily armored, so it probably won't be fast enough to deal with torpedo boats. But the Perseus does have torpedoes, so it's kind of a torpedo boat, and it's kind of not. I'm not sure how to take all that. But really, this comes down to a few things when it comes to my ships. Is just like looking at the ships now, it doesn't seem that worth it to not buy the big ships. Because like I've put a few $1,000s into Star Citizen back in the day, okay? And I can still fly all those ships fine, no problem. But I can't man a fleet by myself. And people are going to want to pilot probably in the bigger ships. Like the Kraken can do a lot of stuff and it can hold a lot of ships. But now I'm starting to kind of see some utility in this. But I've been trying to separate all of these ships into different setups and groups. I got like tons of notes all over pieces of paper and I tried to like settle things out. But essentially, I'm thinking this is where this is going, okay? So the planets are the shallows, okay? So space is the ocean, the planets are the shallows. Gunboats, which I also like, I don't know if they're a gunboat or if they're a kind of a small corvette. I'd basically say they're gunboats, but Connies, I think, are like the shoreline gunboats. But also the Connies, from some stuff that I've read, there's boats that were used that were small. They had anti-air defense and guns on them for like convoys for like amphibious assaults and things. And the Connie kind of fits into that role as well. So the Connie's like in this weird hybrid of where it's like a short range patrol boat kind or a short range like gunboat, but it's also kind of like a military transport truck, and it's also kind of like a uh, anti-air ship that you can have in your fleet, which is kind of weird. So basically, there's these gunboat groups that you can have, um, and there's these shallow water ship groups that like the military's talked about using over and over. And the shallow water ships also, I think, apply to the Perseus and stuff as well because they're basically the shallow water battleships and stuff. They're the things that are going to be able to go in and out of the planet's surface and kind of do some damage and leave. So I think they're more of the shallow water like control ships that can kind of hold the edges and stuff. The Connies are the gunboats that set on the planet's surface and kind of shoot things with missiles. They're like anti-air missile barrage ships and stuff, but they are capable of going out and fighting some of the smaller ships. And they're probably somewhat useful in convoys if they really needed to be. And essentially, if you look at like a gunboat group, you'd be on a planet's surface and you would have a liberator sitting somewhere on the surface basically. And then you would have like 4 to 6 Connies running around doing missions and fighting, and then going back to the Liberator to restock on ammunition and stuff is essentially how this would work. But you would have, a bunch of supplies on the Liberator, and then maybe some support fighters or something. But that would basically be it. It's like you would have the Connies, the Liberator, maybe you'd have Crucibles and stuff. And for me, this is where I start getting into like most of the ships in the game you can kind of like scratch off like industrial ships are an industrial ship, science ships are science ships, but military ships, they're always going to kind of be around. And if you want to do anything else, you're going to be having to control the ground that you're landing on, which means you're going to need military ships to kind of do that. And then also like most of the military ships, besides like base building ships, are giving you the resources that you need to like repair and manage a force on the ground like the Crucible, for example. So like I think most people are going to need a Crucible and a Starfarer just in general. And then the Liberator is just another thing on top of that. So because the Crucible's like all of your repair needs, Starfarer's all your other stuff, and then you need to ship in supplies after that point. And it's kind of a mobile base of operations. But essentially, you then have amphibious assault groups, right? And there's like a strike force that you can have, and then there's just an amphibious assault like group that's like 3 ships. So essentially, what you would have is one Carrack and 2 Liberators, and then you would have one Liberator completely covered with like transport helicopters and stuff like that, and then you'd have the other Liberator with ground vehicles like tanks, and then maybe like a Valkyrie or something on top of it. And then essentially the Valkyrie is like a Chinook kind of transport helicopter thing. The Redeemers are kind of like the Apache helicopters, and then the Harbingers or the Vanguards are more like the Seahawks and stuff that are like Navy helicopter ships, but they're a plane in Star Citizen. So it's kind of like this weird thing where it's, a plane, and I'm not sure how well that's going to work, but it has like similar armaments to that on the other things. And that's the other things. Like there isn't a lot of helicopters, but like the Retaliators, not the Retaliator, the Redeemers, like the only helicopter in Star Citizen, it seems like. All right. So you'd have basically you have a Liberator that has not that many troops on it, heavy vehicles, no internal aircraft, essentially, but you could lay something on top of it. You could potentially replace this with a Crucible, depending on how big the Crucible is. Because low troops and heavy vehicles, and it's probably more focused on repairing ground vehicles. You could probably replace that with the Crucible at some point. Um, then you have a Liberator that has a lot of troops and has all the helos, the jets, and you're probably going to have like 6 of those jets in there, and then a number of, probably Argo cargos or PCs. And then I would have 2 Redeemers on there. And then probably on some of these you might want like a Terrapin maybe, or a Harbinger. I would say like you'd be a toss up between a Harbinger and Eclipse also on these, because you'd get those kind of uses off of it. And then you have the Carrack, which is basically troops and light vehicles. And the Carrack, it can just land on the ground and drop troops off and kind of secure the ground first. So that makes sense. But then if you're going to have a group, so if that group is going by itself, it's going by itself. But if it's having escorts, then you're going to have like one submarine potentially. You could have another Liberator that's purely an aircraft carrier with like 15 jets on it, and then one submarine. And then you could have, any like probably like 2 to 4 Nautilus, or 2 Nautilus and 2 Perseus. Or you could have a Nautilus and a Perseus, and then you would have like Connies and stuff, basically, that would like walk that force in if you really needed it, essentially, is what I'm kind of seeing here. And then you have to get your support ships on the ground at some point. So like the Apollos, the Crucibles, and the Starfarers are like the main ones, but the Crucible and the Starfarer is the main deal. The Apollo doesn't really matter that much. But then you get into Fleet Command, which is something I don't see anyone talk about. And for me, this is why I'm thinking the Endeavor. I'm starting to think about picking up some Endeavors, because you could essentially make a city in space with Endeavors, as long as they could connect together. So they have a number of plays. So anywhere between like 2 and 3 Endeavors. So in a military sense, you could have 2 kind of fleet hospitals, and like a telescope to kind of look at positions and find things of interest in space. Okay, so you could do that and just be able to supply 2 fleets with medical staff and stuff. But you could also go 1 medical endeavor, 1 telescope science endeavor, and then 1 collider endeavor, or, extra crew or food production if you really wanted to. Um, I would say if you go military, if it's like a military fleet command, I would probably go like food production, or uh extra living quarters, and then you go telescope science modules, and then you do the hospital module, and then you would have a hangar on each of those, and then in those hangars you'd have probably Apollos, or you could swap it out with whatever else. But another option for fleet, and basically fleet command, I think, is something that people are kind of not looking at, because it's not really a combat role. But essentially, you need intelligence if you're going to be having military groups and stuff go around. Like, why would you just randomly travel around with no point in direction to go? And So if you have those, you can kind of do that. But also, I got to thinking about this. I was looking at the Banu Merchantman, and it still has two docking collars on the bottom. So as long as those two docking collars stay, that means that you can attach at least two Endeavors to it potentially, as long as it fits. I don't know how the docking collars are going to work. That's probably the biggest issue because the Banu Merchantman's kind of large. And the other thing is like it'd be hard to dock multiple ships to this. But I've had this debate with people before with the Banu Merchantman and the Defender, because people with Kraken say that the Banu Merchantman isn't capable of fighting a Kraken. But Banu Defenders, even though they're not like the best fighters in the world, have like 5 times the range when it comes to their fuel capacity. So you could potentially have them following the Banu Merchantmen around and then just refilling them up when you need them, which is probably what they're meant to do anyway, which means that the Banu Merchantman's probably able to fill up their quantum and their hydrogen fuel potentially. But also you have whatchamacallit, they don't have anywhere to store them. And the Banu Defender is actually a very unique ship in the sense that it's a fighter with 2 seats, 2 beds, in an internal space, which means you can use it to haul small amounts of cargo. You can use it to haul small amounts of passengers. And I think you could also use it as a medical ship if you have the medical endeavor, because if you have the Defender, you could fly out and then pick up injured people and fly them back to the hospital with its increased range. But that also means that if you're docking your Banu Merchantmen with the Endeavors, you would have the ability to bring people to your hospital, then let them into your um, markets to kind of shop and buy gear. And then if you have another Endeavor with a super collider, you could be overclocking the weapons and stuff that they can buy there. So you could essentially bring in extra gear from combat zones and missions, bring it in, and then upgrade them with the collider, and then sell them inside your shops, and then also provide medical services and stuff there. And if you have the satellite relay, you'd be able to sell information for people to go look and find. So you'd have 3 ways to make money, or 4 ways to make money with the Banu Defender there, and then you would have the Banu Merchantman able to detach and go to planet surfaces to sell goods or to buy new stock of goods or whatever else. But it gives you 3 hangars that you could potentially hold multiple defenders in, which is probably the biggest thing that the Banu Merchantman doesn't have. And then they're all capital ships, so they can fly together, you know. And then you also have, if the detachable cab stays in, you'd have 3 transport ships that could transport players from wherever your city is to wherever they're going, for the most part, or to other ships that approach to like drop them off. But you could also use them as like ferries. So even if you're not able to connect to all of the Endeavors, you could still have them setting out and then just have players go into the cab of the ship, detach from the platform, and then reattach to another platform. So you just change the ship parts around basically so that they can all align and just kind of transport people to and from each station point. Kind of like Orison is. So I think that'd be pretty good. But then you have like aircraft fleet carriers or aircraft fleets or whatever. Apparently, the aircraft carrier is the only thing that has a hospital in like the military fleets. So the Kraken, if it doesn't have a tier 1, is kind of suffering in that regard. And the Liberators don't have those at all. Um, and anything bigger than the Kraken, we just don't have access to unless you find it in the game anyway. So they're not really the most complex things in the world, and it's supposed to be a hospital, but probably isn't super great. So you're probably going to have something that can ferry people in and out, or pretty much anything else that you can kind of heal people with. But militaries also have hospital ships, which would be the Endeavor Hospital, that can get detached and moved to military zones. So that would basically be what you could use that as your fleet command ship. And then you have these carrier battle groups, which apparently is like a carrier, a support carrier, destroyers, supply ships, subs, and then support ships. So there's a bunch of different things here. But if you're having like a carrier, like even if you're using the Kraken, because I was trying to put 4 Redeemers on the Kraken and think this through. But if the Redeemers are Apache helicopters, they're good, but they're not going to be crazy. Whereas if you have Harbingers or like Vanguards, you would have multiple different sizes of missiles and then multiple torpedoes and decent guns. So you basically have fighters that are also essentially Seahawk helicopters. And then you could have, whatever other fighters and stuff that you wanted on your ship. Oh, like terrapins and stuff like that. But then, like, you have, like, the Polaris, which is a Corvette in the game. And essentially, ships like that are used on shorelines, and they're capable of going out to sea, but they're not really made for, like, sea voyages. And I forgot what it said that it replaces. I think it said overlaps with the frigate. So the frigate would be the Idris. So essentially, the Polaris and the Idris are interchangeable, but the Idris is more durable than a Polaris. And then the Polaris is supposed to have a anti-sub helicopter if it's used like a military ship. Um, which would be like the Harbinger or put like an Eclipse or something in there, I guess. But I guess they're kind of doing the roles of a destroyer. They kind of protect the destroyers. So like if a Javelin is a destroyer and a Idris is a frigate and the Polaris is a corvette, and they're all capable of destroying torpedo boats and stuff. Essentially, the Polaris is the short range one for local defenses against the edges of, you know, shorelines and stuff to protect your other ships while they're there, I suppose. And then the Idris is the open sea ship that's able to do the job so you don't risk your javelins. And then your support ships would be, I guess, things like the Perseus and the Hammerhead stuff. But I think there's some differences between some of these. So with smaller fleets, like if you're using liberators and you're doing amphibious assaults and stuff, I think the Perseus has more benefits um, because it can deal with bigger ships. And then your smaller ships are still able to somewhat fight fighters. But if you get into the bigger ships, I think that the hammerheads are starting to have more use because they can deal with uh, fighter groups while your fighters are not there. So if you have a carrier, the hammerheads can kill the fighters while your carrier gets ready to launch things. Essentially, is what I'm kind of seeing. But it seems like most ships in the game are able to deal a decent amount of damage to subcapital ships and capital ships and have torpedoes or mines or something along the lines that can deal damage. So the Perseus versus the Polaris, for example, if the Polaris is a corvette, then it has light armor, like it's not very well armored, but it's still able to do similar jobs as a frigate, which is more armored, which can do similar jobs to a destroyer, which I guess in this case would be even more armored than the frigate. But the Perseus is a frigate. It's a frigate or it's a cruiser. I think it's more of a cruiser. Hard to say. It's probably like an armored cruiser. So I think its armor is going to be better than the Polaris. So I think its size 7 guns would be good enough to damage a Polaris pretty good. But its its armor, it's going to be probably slower, and its armor isn't going to be like super amazing. And I think this is where you get the trade-off of like the Perseus being able to like kind of deal with capital ships, but the size 5 torpedoes are only able to like do minor damage compared to like a size 9. And then the Perseus's size 12 torpedoes are able to destroy or severely damage bigger capital ships. But they aren't going to be, and they'd probably be able to destroy the Perseus. But the Perseus has heavier armor to deal with like the small fire and stuff to deal with everything. Hmm. So here's another thing. So this first carrier group, so carrier battle group said carrier, support carrier, destroyer, supply ships, subs, and support ships. And then even the amphibious assault groups, they have like a Carrack, 2 Liberators, then you'd have like a Perseus, a Retaliator, and probably a Nautilus, or you'd have like a Perseus and a Retaliator and 2 Andromeda, something along those lines. But then there's a carrier group, which basically said that there's 2 small ships that are armed with missiles and like small caliber machine guns, and then 3 to 4 destroyers slash frigates, and then you'd have 1 sub. So when it says destroyer slash frigates on a carrier group, I'm guessing the Andromeda are the support ships, the Retaliators the sub, the destroyers would be probably the Nautilus. And then you'd have a support carrier, which would be like, if you're using a Kraken, it would be the Liberator probably. And then you would have your Kraken as your primary. I have so much stuff that I wrote down with all these things. It's kind of crazy. Because, like, the Terrapin scanning abilities and stuff like that are useful in a fleet. But you also have, like, the Hornet Scout. And you have the Harbinger. There's, like, a lot of different stuff. And then there's stuff like armored battle cruisers. Seems more like the Perseus. And the armored battle cruisers, though, are supposed to be long-range, independent warships, able to beat slash fight all but battleships. And if the Perseus is an armored cruiser, that means that it could deal enough damage to kill Polaris. It would have enough damage to deal with a Nautilus. It would have enough damage to deal with a Retaliator. It would probably be not as close against the Idris. I don't know on that one because an armored cruiser, if it's able to fight most things besides another battleship, then it would be able to fight a javelin. And it might be able to, but the only battleship that we know of is the actual big capital battleship. But it's weird because like everything's kind of a toss up because there's also things with like modern day destroyers. Apparently some of them have like 6 to 9 giant torpedoes that they use to blow things up. But it also seems that most destroyers have anti-air missiles, which the Retaliator doesn't. It has the guns. So you could have anti-air guns and the bombs, but it doesn't really look like a destroyer. And then the Nautilus has a bigger gun, two smaller guns, a missile launcher, and then mines. But I don't really see a Retaliator necessarily as a submarine, even though it reminds me a lot of a submarine. Like it could kind of be like it can kind of do anti-air and it can kind of do anti-sub. So it's like a torpedo boat. So it's like that's like stage one destroyer, torpedo boat destroyer, and then the Nautilus is like stage two, and the Perseus is like the armored cruiser. Any case, thinking on this, all it really means is if you want to do like a full assault force, like a planetary attack, you don't necessarily need the capital ships. To do a full force, you'd only really need a Carrack and then 2 to 3 Liberators. You'd have rovers and stuff in the Carrack, maybe some Argo cargos if you wanted. Then you would have a Liberator with probably 2 Redeemers, 6 jets maybe, and then you would have more Argo cargos or PCs inside just for transporting, stuff around, troops and stuff. And then on the second Liberator, you would have a Valkyrie on top, then maybe a Terrapin potentially, or you could do a Terrapin, or you could do Valkyrie on top, and then have, I guess you could do 6 more jets if you wanted to, and then you could have 2 tanks or something along those lines, or you could do a Valkyrie on top and have some ground vehicles. Like you could have 2 tanks and then or a tank and then some ballistas. You could basically have it loaded with as many heavier ground vehicles as you want, and then the Valkyrie. And then essentially the Valkyrie would be able to transport all your smaller vehicles around, but it wouldn't be able to transport. So like you could do rock miners, and a couple of tanks, and then you land the Valkyrie, and then the Valkyrie can transport all your troops on the ground, so you don't have to use any of the other ship's fuel, and to be able to transport your rock miners and your uh, rovers around the planet. And then the tanks would be able to provide defense, you know, or power when you're like trying to assault something. and then the other one has basically your two Apache helicopters, which will escort the Valkyrie, and then you would have I would probably keep like an Eclipse or something around just to be able to deal with bigger threats in case you left some of your other stuff and or like you kept some of your stuff away. And then you have like six jets and some helos and stuff to kind of transport your people around. So if you're doing anything small scale, you could probably just use an Argo or something, carry people around, or PCs. And then something goes wrong, you'd send in an Apache or the Vanguard or the Valkyrie to kind of go in and get them. But if any of those like get destroyed, then you kind of just lost that functionality because you don't have any backups. The only other thing you could do is put two Valkyries, so one Valkyrie on each, and then have two Apaches on the front. I don't know if there's enough room for all that. Even then, though, if you lose an Apache, you lose an Apache. So, I mean, you'd probably just send your one of your transport thing back and get some more stuff. But if you wanted to land a lot more ground vehicles on the ground, then you could bring in a third Liberator as a makeshift aircraft carrier. Put all your planes and stuff on the third Liberator, um, and then use the first two Liberators to drop off ground vehicles and say, you know, say that the first two Liberators you have ground vehicles, you have two Valkyries, and you have two Redeemers, and then on the aircraft carrier you have two more Redeemers, and then you have full jets inside of it or something along those lines. Then you could drop everything off and it could support you with those fighters and stuff. And then you'd probably have a Perseus, a Nautilus, a Retaliator, and then probably a couple Connie or something. Because the Connie can drop off and move rovers as well and rock miners. Yeah, that is another option that you could do. If you brought two Connies instead of two Retaliators, I think you get the same size 5 guns. Because I think, or the Redeemer. Try to look at it real quick before I have to go outside. Thinking the Redeemer has two size 5 turrets and then like a size 4 turret or something on the bottom. So you get two size 4s on the wings, I believe. And then two size 3s. On the front. So you get two size 3s on the nose, two size 4s, or wait, you get two size 4s and then you get two size 3 turrets. So you got four size 3s, two size 4s, and then you get two size 5 turrets, and then you get uh, a number of missiles. You get 16 missiles. And if you go with the Connie, you would have two size 2 turrets, and then 4 size 5s, and a lot more missiles. So you'd give up 2 size 4 guns for a snubcraft and a hangar bay. I don't know what's better there, to be honest. I mean, even Valkyrie wise, like the Valkyrie can carry a lot of troops, but the Andromeda can still carry a decent amount of stuff. They can both carry the same vehicles. But essentially, you would have 2 Andromeda and a Valkyrie on the ground, and 2. Yeah, if the Andromeda fly in with you, you'd have 2 Andromeda. You would have your Valkyrie. You would have 2 Redeemers. So you'd be able to move 3 rovers at a time. And then if you do the 3 Liberators, you would have 4 Redeemers, 2 Valkyries, 2 Andromeda. Interesting. Any case, though, the cheapest thing that I'm thinking about right now when it comes to like capital ships and stuff, because I've been going through, like, I love battleships, okay, and I'm not sure how I feel about the Banu Merchantmen and the Banu Defenders at the moment, but I'm really starting to think just a Banu Merchantman with 3 or 4 Endeavors, and then a bunch of Banu Defenders. And then you just fly around system to system. You collect the information, you upgrade components. So instead of having like a Kraken, so like let's say the Endeavor has a medium-sized pad and you have 3 Endeavors, you would have most of a Kraken's size there for pads. You'd be missing. If you had 4, you would have, I think 4 would basically be almost the same. And then you would have however many Banu Defenders that you have, but you'd be able to operate that in that city pretty well, I would think. Be able to do research, find things to investigate, and then you'd be able to sell that to people so they could find it for you. But if you're giving people hospital treatment, you need something to defend yourself with. I'm gonna hop off. Anyway, it's been a crazy thought process for all this, and I'm still kind of rattling my head with it. And I don't know when my house is gonna have internet again, so it might be a while.